Try Jesus Auburn family. It's Dustin with you once again, and I'm coming to you solo this time here in my office studio, and it's a privilege to be with you all again. Thank you for watching and listening wherever you may be. Remember, it always helps us with these videos, and it helps the Try Jesus family expand when you click subscribe, when you like and share, when you tell people about it. Also, the website is there, tryjesusauburn.com. We would love to have you check out what we have there. Remember, we have a Tuesday night in-person Bible study. You are invited. It's 1 hour. It's concise. It's on Tuesday, as I said, and you can find out more by emailing us on the website. And actually, let me know that you want to come, because then I can have materials all prepared for you and ready to go, and that way you can feel welcome and at home and right along with the group. It's a small group. It's not a big group, and we have a lot of fun and we learn a lot about God. So I want to invite you to be with us for that. So I have a really what I find is intriguing and interesting and important topic to share today in the podcast. And it actually comes from an email from a podcast family member. And it comes from a man named Emery. And Emery is new to Christianity. He's on his journey and learning a lot of things. And he's been mixed up a little bit about this discussion about politics and being woke. And his basic question was, MLK Day is coming up. What should I think about it? Is it okay for followers of Jesus to celebrate MLK Day? What should we do on it? What should we think about it? I thought this was a really interesting question and says a lot about what's happening in our world and the political climate that we're in. And so I thought I'd just share some things and share some thoughts about MLK Day and what it means to me and how I think Christians can relate to it and some biblical principles behind it. So I did a little research actually about the holiday, and I didn't know this, but it was not a national holiday until 1983. I couldn't believe that. I guess I didn't know when it was instituted as a holiday, but I did not know that the nation didn't start celebrating it until 1983. And it was actually introduced to the government, to Congress, in 1968 by one of Martin Luther King's close confidants and friends. And it took until 1983 for it to become voted as a national holiday. It took that long and observed. Another interesting tidbit is that the famous musician Stevie Wonder actually had a big hand in it in helping people understand why it would be important to celebrate the day in honor of Martin Luther King Jr. and the civil rights movement. And so it was, as I said, it was first observed in 1986. And in some states, it took as many as 17 years for them to observe and recognize it as a national holiday. The last 2 or 3 states to observe it was New Hampshire in 1999, as early as 1999, is recent. Utah in 2000 and South Carolina in 2000. So really surprised that it took that long. I think New Hampshire was celebrating Civil Rights Day. That's what they called it instead of Martin Luther King Jr. Day. But just a little history there. And another little fact, in 1966, only one third, in 66, while King was still alive, only one third of Americans had a favorable view of him. Huh. So, there's a lot of things we could think about with that, but the way the media was portraying it, the way society was portraying it, all the upheaval and the unrest, and I'm sure some people, even though if they weren't really schooled in the civil rights movement and couldn't relate to it because of the culture and where they grew up, people in different parts of the country where they weren't exposed to as many minorities, they may have seen in King more of as a disruptor than somebody to be celebrated. And let's talk a little bit more about that as well. So, Some people, some opponents of Martin Luther King Jr. Day, have called his character into question. It seems like anytime we lift somebody up and revere them and honor them, people want to dig into their life. And it is true that there were some inconsistencies in Martin Luther King Jr.'s life. It's just fact. There was some infidelity there. And it's interesting that people don't recognize this, but staunch, even Bible students, don't even understand this because he's more recent than our Bible heroes. But as you look throughout the Bible, show me one, other than Jesus, show me one biblical hero that didn't have inconsistencies in their lives. Now, don't get me wrong, that's not an excuse for us to go around and be rascals and cheat on our spouse and things like that. That's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying there's a human element to this. And what makes the Bible so beautiful is that it uplifts and helps us revere fallen and broken and frail human beings just like us. And King was like one of those people, stood up for rights and stood up for kingdom principles, but had some inconsistencies in his life. And just like we honor heroes from the Bible, we should be able to look up to people even with inconsistencies in their lives here today. And of course, it's some shaky ground, and it matters what the person did. But that to me doesn't disqualify him from being someone that we can look up to and admire. Some don't like his political approach and his politics and his way of dealing with things and dealing with the government, and we don't have time to get into that. An interesting one, even proponents today from even some minority communities don't like the fact that King emphasized being colorblind, essentially. And this is hotly debated. And Emery, if you're listening, you probably have picked up on some of these issues as well. I'm trying to figure out how to navigate that. And there would be other people more qualified than me to talk to this issue. But there are some people that say, being colorblind doesn't help. We need to acknowledge and see differences and diversity among us and differences of culture in order to appreciate people better. So they don't really resonate with some of King's messages about colorblindness and unity in that way. But I would still say, let's look deeper at what his message was. And as a Christian, can we agree with what he was saying and what he was teaching? And as I was preparing to come on here, I was looking at King's quotes, and there are so many powerful, poignant, clear quotes that he had. He was so good at being able to say in a sentence or two what it would take me an hour to explain. And I have some of those quotes. I wanted to share some of those with you now that are very biblical, very biblical. And I know he was a preacher and got many of these principles and the things that he taught right from the Bible. So I want to share some of those with you. This is one that's used to this day in protests and things, but I wanted to bring it up because it's absolutely biblical. There is no peace without justice. Let's pause on that for just a second. There is no peace without justice. Um, Deep within the Bible, there is this acknowledgement that God is holy and righteous and good, and that one day he's going to make all wrongs right, and we call that heaven, or the new heavens and the new earth, the earth made new. So deep within us as human beings, we all agree with that statement. There is no peace without justice. Where there is injustice, there will be hurt. Where there is injustice, there will be pain and oppression. And so we all long for this. And what's really interesting is that there's a lot of people out there that don't acknowledge God, that don't believe in God, that don't acknowledge his lordship over our lives. And my question to them would be, how do we know what justice is if there's not a higher authority above us? How do we know what peace is if there's not a higher authority and a creator, a one to tell us what life was always about? Because what we have here is broken. It's full of hurt and pain and oppression and sadness and sorrow. How do we know what's right and how to live? And if there's no higher authority, really, that just leaves us vulnerable to whoever is most powerful to tell us what's right and good and just, which is what Martin Luther King Jr. was speaking out against and demonstrating against people in powerful positions, trying to keep people that didn't have as much power down and oppressed and not rise them to the level of equality. So this is true, and this gets used in protests and things to this day. And I just hope people that use it are careful with the way that they use it, because it is such a deeply biblical concept. And if you use it for your own devices and not uh, godly ones, we don't want to use the word of God that way. So let's look at another quote here. Darkness cannot drive out darkness. Hate cannot drive out hate. This sounds like a number of Bible verses. At first, when I see darkness cannot drive out darkness, um, I think of John 1, where John is talking about Jesus was the light that came into the world. The darkness didn't recognize him, but yet he was a light shining in the darkness. And you know, that second part really clarifies the statement here. Hate cannot drive out hate. In other words, you can't use sinful means or hateful means to drive out hate. It just compounds the hate. Love must overcome hate. Light must overcome darkness. And what's powerful about this is that it doesn't take a lot of light to pierce through darkness. If you've ever been in a really dark room or out on a dark night, if you've ever been camping, and it's really dark in the woods, you can see a campfire from miles away. That little point of light makes such a difference in such a dark place. And so we need to remember that when we face injustice, when we face hatred, when we face oppression in many different ways, when people mistreat us, when they gossip against us, we cannot overcome that hatred and that pain with more hatred and pain and causing pain. We need to be the light. We want to live the light. We want to live as Jesus lived. We want to live for truth and goodness and justice and mercy. And so another powerful, powerful quote here, that's very biblical. And I could have come up with 60 different quotes from Dr. King that we could learn from. So the third quote, another one, same idea. Let no man pull you so low as to hate him. Wow, that's powerful. Again, hate cannot drive out hate. And if you think about the civil rights movement and a lot of the ignorance and the racism that was in our country during that time and before that time, you just really think about the fact that people that had been so mistreated, Dr. King is calling on them not to hate back, not to judge back, but to rise above the feelings of hatred. And boy, that's such a natural human response, isn't it? And I think of Jesus when I think of this quote, because there was a lot of injustice done to God because of sin, a lot of injustice done to Jesus in his life. And he didn't allow that injustice to make him hate us. By rights, God could have just snuffed us out, snapped his fingers, and we're gone. We're done for. But the more it seems we hated Jesus, the more love he poured out on us. Such a powerful truth. And so, in the end, because of Jesus loving us despite the hatred that we showed him, love won, and love will win. And that was Dr. King's message. Despite the hatred and the vitriol and the racism and the violence that was being done against people who are advocating for their own rights and the rights of others, don't let people pull you down. That's such a powerful reminder. Rise above it. Don't repay evil with evil, the Bible says, but return it with a blessing. Return it with a blessing. Let's look at another quote. This is one of the famous ones. It comes from the March on Washington speech. I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a world where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but the content of their character. Powerful stuff there, and meaningful and wonderful. And this is where we start to talk about some things that have been sort of politicized. And the question to this day, right now, that's going on is, does racism actually exist? And there would be people that are more qualified than me to talk about that. And there's different views about that. And just really quickly, racism is more than bias. Racism is more than prejudice. Racism is an active um, pursuit or an attempt to hold entire races of people lower than you, oppress them through various means, through government, through actions, through finances, and things like that. So racism is, yes, prejudice is included, but it includes more than just that. So a lot of people look at our country and they look at our society and they say, well, I mean, people of minorities and they have lots of opportunities and they, much more than ever. And so this debate goes back and forth. And I don't want to get into that today. But I do want to get into something else, and that something that we can realize that is a human problem in all of us, no matter what our skin color, no matter what our nationality. It's a human problem because it's a sin problem. And that is the problem of bias, of prejudice, of hatred, and of fear. And King talked a lot about those issues. And let me just tell you a story. I grew up in Corning, down in Corning, a couple hours from here, a little less. And I went to Corning West. That was before East and West merged and created one central school district. And I in my school, I can remember maybe 3 or 4 black kids attending, 3 or 4 tops. And I didn't think much of it. I didn't ever think, I'm prejudiced or I'm ignorant or anything like that. I appreciated some of the music that was coming out of the 90s. Probably wouldn't listen to it now that I'm a little closer to Jesus, but you get the idea. Black culture became something that was intriguing during that time, and got into a little bit of that myself through the music and things. And I never saw myself as ignorant. I never thought that I had prejudice or judgment. I never thought there would be any issues of disconnect between myself and people that were minorities. But what I didn't realize is that I had such a small amount of interaction with people who were black, African Americans, other people of color. I had such a small interaction with them, which means that I didn't have a lot of exposure to their culture. I didn't have a lot of exposure to where they came from. I didn't hear their stories. I hadn't learned about their lives and the lives of their families, and the stories of how their families got to live in Corning at that time. And so I never had outward hatred. I never had outward bias against minorities, but there definitely was some ignorance because I just didn't have a lot of exposure to African Americans and people that were um, of minorities. I just didn't, because where I grew up, there weren't that many people of color. And I think for a lot of us, this is actually the case. And despite your skin color, despite your ethnicity or your race, where you grow up and the culture that you grow up, if you don't have a lot of exposure to people that are different from you or have different backgrounds or upbringings, that makes a huge difference. Because whether you want to make this about race or culture, where you grow up, the family that you're in, the things that you learn in school, the opportunities that you have or don't have, the blessings that you've experienced, the hardships that you've gone through in life, all of these things work together to make us who we are as people. And so it wasn't until I about 10, 12 years ago, I was called to pastor a church in Minneapolis. And this church was full of various different ethnicities and races. We had about 35 different countries represented in our church there. It's very diverse. It was a really exciting place to be, even still is to this day. And I just got to know people from Africa. I got to know people that were American born, but were African Americans and Asian Americans. I just began to realize, wow, there are such broad differences among us that just because of upbringing and culture and society and the foods that we eat. And there are all these differences, and these differences have a way of help making us see the world differently. And it wasn't until I spent time with people that didn't look like me or come from a similar culture. By the way, here's a little caveat. Let me stop here, rattling on for a minute. Think about this. Have you even had a sibling before where you wonder, how in the world did we grow up in the same house? Because they're so much different. They're so different from me. And you have to really spend time trying to understand other humans, to appreciate them and understand where they're coming from and why they may interpret the world differently than you. And yes, race matters, culture matters, where we come from matters, how our ancestors got to this country matter. It all plays into how we view the world, how we experience the world, how the world has treated us. And it wasn't until I got to Minneapolis and was around different people from different cultures that I began to understand I see things differently than other people. I communicate differently than other people. And so I think we all have to come to the term, all of us have to come to terms with the fact that we must love people enough to get to know them. Like King said, judge them by the content of their character, not the color of their skin. Because I'm going to say something that is powerful, and hopefully it resonates and you can think about this. We tend to fear what we don't understand. Let me say that again. We tend to fear what we don't understand. So we may not be, trembling in our boots or shaking or sweating because a person is from a different culture than us, but we may feel threatened by the things that they say and do, by the way that they live their lives. Let me give you an example of this, all right? So in my church in Minneapolis, we had a large number of people that were from Kenya. Lovely people, beautiful people. Much different culture, though, in many ways. And in that church, we had this issue because people that looked like me were questioning the parenting abilities of some of these families who had young children. Because the Kenyans tended to let their kids just kind of go and be on their own in church. And many of the American born folks, white folks like me, and others that were just American born, would look at that and go, these people are terrible parents. How can they just let their kids run in church? How can they let them make this much noise in church and not be around them and correct them? Well, after spending time with the folks from Kenya, I learned something that changed my entire outlook. And that is, in their culture, as a parent, I don't raise my kids. We raise our kids. So the idea of it takes a village. So they were expecting the other adults to parent their children, which is way different than the way my culture tells me to parent. Because my culture tells me that I'm in charge of my kids, I'm responsible for my kids, and you better not say a word to them. If you have an issue with my kid, you come and talk to me, you don't talk to them. That's my culture. But there was such a disconnect between the worldview of parenting between the Kenyans and the American born folks, and there were all these judgments taking place. And it wasn't until we spent time together and sat down together to understand these different worldviews that we began to see each other differently. And so I have to say, there was ignorance, there was judgment on both sides, but especially toward the Kenyans. Because the Kenyans were saying, well, why don't these people help raise my kids? Don't they care about my kids? Don't they love my kids? So they're making judgments from that direction. We're making judgments from the other direction. But it wasn't until we came together to get to know each other more deeply and on an intimate level that we began to have an experience of building bridges. And this idea that we tend to fear what we don't understand. Fear, like I said, maybe not be like shaking in our boots and our palms sweating, but it may be judgment calls. It might be trying to control. It might be trying to even hold down and oppress, like we've seen in past generations with racism and things like this. We fear what we don't understand. And what I want us to understand and really grasp is that for if you are out there like me, all of us, if you grew up in a place where you were not exposed to people that were much different than you. In other words, people around you all grew up in the same place, they all have the same culture, they all talk the same, we all think the same way. We're probably kind of ignorant to people that are from other cultures. We probably are. And that ignorance can play into our relationships and how we view and interpret each other and how we communicate. So we need to be aware of this, and again, get beyond the what the book looks like on the outside. Get to know people, love people, connect with people, and this was largely Martin Luther King Jr.'s message. There's a few Bible verses that I want us to look at too before we close. Oh, and by the way, I said this is a human problem. It's a human problem because we tend to fear. All humans tend to fear what we don't understand. And as a result of that, it often manifests itself, whether intentionally or unintentionally, as prejudice and bias. We have that tendency. And so, if you look into the histories in this country of the Irish immigrants, of the Native Americans, of the Asian Americans, of Catholics, of Protestants, you will see a very checkered history because this is a human problem. This is not just a black-white problem. This is a human problem that sin and selfishness has caused. So we need to keep this in mind and understand what God is trying to do by rooting out these biases, rooting out this prejudice so that we can truly judge a person based on the content of their character and not the color of their skin or their culture or whatever it might be. So I want to look at a couple verses. So let's look first here at this one. This is Paul. And in Paul's day, there was a lot of prejudice going on. The Jews thought they were better than the Gentiles. The Gentiles thought they were better than the Jews. Men were uplifted in society over women. A lot of the same kinds of issues that we're talking about when we talk about civil rights and social justice and these sorts of things. Galatians chapter 2 and verse 27, Paul says something very powerful about the family of God. For all who have put on Christ, there is neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male nor female, for all are one in Christ Jesus. God is putting the human family back together through Jesus and the change that Jesus creates in our lives. By the way, just as a sidebar, people say Christianity is full of judgment, Christianity is full of hate. Look at this verse. This was absolutely revolutionary at the time and is the principle that we're all striving for when we celebrate Martin Luther King Jr. Day. We are one. We're one human family. No division, no separation, no prejudice, no bias. We are one. And the Bible tells us that when we surrender our hearts to Jesus, when he changes us, when he uproots that selfishness and that sin out of us, we can become one human family, unbiased, unprejudiced, loving people for who they are in Jesus. How do we get to that point, though? What needs to take place? How do we truly begin to see each other for who we are? There's an interesting passage here in 1 Corinthians chapter 12. So this isn't a passage about the gifts that become part of our lives when Jesus enters, right? So when Jesus comes into our lives, he wants us to be able to share the good news. He wants to create this human family. And so he gives us special gifts. They're called spiritual gifts that that the Holy Spirit specifically gives us to accomplish God's work in our lives and in our hearts and in our world. So here's some of those. And he's listing them here. To another, God gives the distinguishing between spirits. Now, people wonder what that means. It means discernment or good judgment. Okay, so track with this. So the Holy Spirit gives us good judgment or the discerning between spirits. To another, the different kinds of tongues, and tongues is a different word for languages. So sometimes when there's a disconnect between the languages that we speak, Jesus can come into our lives and help us speak one another's language. And I don't think that just means Chinese to English. I think that means being able to communicate, because as we said earlier, sometimes we can all be speaking the same language and never really communicating. And so this here means we can speak in a way that other people can understand. And then there is the interpretation of what they're saying. And as we said earlier, my example about our Kenyan folks, there's an interpretation to what people are saying and the way that they're talking. Even in our own country, we laugh about things like, when you're in the South, people can be complimenting you and putting you down at the same time. Oh, bless your heart. They can be complimenting you and criticizing you at the same time. If somebody says, "Oh, bless your heart," it's not necessarily a compliment in the South. You go to the Midwest. I have a lot of Midwestern friends. We were in Minneapolis, as I said, and they tend to be very not as open as us here in the Northeast. We just tend to tell you like it is. We don't have time to deal with any niceties. We're just going to get our point across. In the Midwest, they're much more gentle, a little more passive aggressive, and they don't want to ruffle any feathers generally. And these are just cultural issues in our own country from East to Midwest. So God comes into our lives and he says, I'm going to give you good judgment in order to be one family. I'm going to let you speak each other's language, let you communicate in a way that you can understand, and I'm going to help you interpret each other, understand what one another is saying. So it's not just the words, but it's also the meaning behind the words. So these are gifts of the Spirit that God gives us, because God wants us to be one family working together to bring hope and peace and healing to our world. So my prayer is that we use these gifts that God gives us to love people, to discern, to use good judgment about where they're coming from and their background and why they may say some of the things that they say, to be able to speak each other's language. I heard one time somebody say, language is not what is said, but what is heard. So you can say or think that you're saying all the right things, but if you don't know how to say it in a way that the other person can hear it and receive it, you're not even clearly communicating, which I hope I'm doing here. I don't know. Communicating clearly. So we have good judgment, we have communication, words that make sense to the people that will hear it, and the people that are hearing interpreting what they're saying based on good judgment and the words that they say. We need the Spirit of God. So, getting back to our original question, Emery, I don't think as Christians we should avoid MLK Day. I think, to me anyway, Martin Luther King Jr. Day is a day that reminds me that I need to love people enough to get to know them. And just because a person is black doesn't mean that all black people have had the same experiences and background and story. Just because a person's white doesn't mean that they all have the same background and experiences and story. Human people deserve our love, our respect, and we need to love them enough to get to know them, to use good judgment, to know that we're one family and be able to communicate and interpret one another in a way where we can show love and give hope and peace. So that's what Martin Luther King Jr. Day reminds me. These are biblical principles. These are biblical truths that God brought through the civil rights movement led by Martin Luther King Jr. in our day, but are eternal truths that God has been trying to get through to us since the beginning of sinfulness, to uproot selfishness, to uproot bias, so we don't fear each other anymore, that we can get to know one another and connect on a deeply powerful level. So that's what Martin Luther King Jr. Day means to me. And so I hope that you're challenged. I hope that you're challenged enough to Get to know people that don't have the same background as you, to learn from them, to listen to them. Let me say this before I close. One of the things that concerns me about the political climate on both sides is that we tend to, when someone seems to disagree with us or doesn't have the same point of view of us, and when it's particularly talking about civil rights and social justice, if they're saying things that we don't tend to agree with or we don't see the same way, we tend to just shut them down. We don't want to listen to it. We judge them. We close the door to that conversation. And I think what we need to learn from our study today and Martin Luther King Jr. Day and the principles of the Bible is that when people are different from us, don't just shut them down because you're threatened by what they might have to say. Listen. And even if you don't agree with what they're saying or you can't understand where they're coming from, at least you'll get to know the person a little more. And that's what it's all about. It's about relationships and love and connecting as people. So I hope that you're challenged to do that. I hope that Martin Luther King Jr. Day will be a reminder for you to get back to these biblical principles of God's family. Love each other enough to get to know one another. Pray for the gifts of the Spirit, that God would fill you with good judgment, with words that can be understood, and with hearing that makes you able to understand and interpret. God bless you. Have a wonderful day off on MLK Day. Reach out to somebody that comes from a different culture than you and learn from them. Blessings. Have a great week.